Let's continue with our efforts to complicate the relationship between religion and science and avoid a very simplified narrative about the two being in conflict with one another. So that just raises the question whether science and religion are natural enemies, as sometimes is perceived in our modern world, or whether they are a match made in the heavens, which is probably the perspective of many of the natural philosophers of this period, many of whom saw their work as peeking into the mind of God and brought in some of their theological or just kind of more less than scientific views into their understanding of the cosmos. So if we start with the traditional received view, which we can call the Aristotelian-Ptolemaic-Galenic view, which really lasted from ancient Greece and Rome and was dominant in Western culture until the 15th century. So the idea here, mostly from Aristotle, is that each object is unique and has unique properties and seeks to come back to the place of its origin, which is why objects fall to the earth, because they're made out of material, made out of matter, whereas heavenly objects, which are made out of that fifth element, quintessence, have circular motion and are naturally inclined to be in the heavens. So in this model, you have a finite world which is unchanging and static, at least the world of the heavens, because they're immutable, they're perfect, they're like God, because they're made out of not the same substance, but they're made out of an eternal substance. So this is geocentric, meaning it's centered on the earth, and there are crystal spheres, as you can see in this model here, and circular motion is what defines the heavenly bodies as opposed to straight line motion, which is on earth. And when it comes to anatomy, you have what's called the humoral theory, the idea that humans have four basic constituents that make up their internal materials, which is blood, black, and then yellow bile, and then phlegm, each of which is associated with a certain personality type. So, for example, those who have a dominance of blood tend to be sanguine, which means courageous in the face of danger. Phlegmatic means calm. So each one of them reflects the balance among the humors, and what we do if somebody is ill is we try to balance the humors out, maybe by using a strategy of purging, which is causing vomiting, or bloodletting using leeches or other methods, or just finding something that will purge the body of the imbalance of humors that is causing disease. So a lot of these ideas were incorporated into medieval scholasticism. This is where the universities basically incorporated classical learning, which served them well for hundreds of years, at least according to the consistency of the theory, which explained seemingly everything. Explained God and theology, explained the natural world, explained philosophy and mathematics, and it was all synthesized into a very coherent view of the world that used reason and logic to mediate what's called the dialectic between the ancient authorities, between the Bible and Christianity, and any kinds of observations of the natural world. And so this was the dominant philosophy within Christianity throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, still taught in universities well into the 17th century, maybe even into the 18th century, and used often by the Catholic Church to explain Christianity. So the idea that we just read off the Bible and that's our science, that's a very simplified view. It's more that you use reason and logic to take two seemingly opposed propositions and reconcile them through Aristotelian logic. So it's not reading off the Bible, it's just using Christian doctrines, which may come from the Bible, and then trying to incorporate them into this kind of logical, rational method. So during the Renaissance, and this is where there's some debate over whether the Renaissance really stimulated the scientific revolution or not, because there was a revival of the classics, many scholars were reading in what's called the Hermetic tradition, so named after the ancient philosopher Hermes Trismegistus. And his view was that there were these forces within nature, we might call them occult forces, which is at the heart of astrology and alchemy. What we're trying to do is we're trying to use our intuitions, our understanding of the world, to try to tap into these forces to understand how human beings fit into the world and how the world is structured. It really comes down to the idea that there's almost like harmonies, mathematical harmonies, a little bit like if you are familiar with the golden ratio, which is found in nature. Oftentimes if you take two measurements of an object, whether it's like even the human body or even like a nautilus shell, it converges on the number 1.61. So this is the kind of thing that mystics in many different religious traditions would be fascinated with, the idea that there's sort of a spiritual logic and harmony to nature. So it's not about measuring. It's not mathematics and the scientific revolution, which is about quantitative thinking. It's the idea that there's a parallel, a metaphor between mathematical logic and reasoning and the way the universe is structured. So the Renaissance moved away from Aristotle and revived Plato. So Plato is all about this idea of ideal forms and the idea that there's a numerical harmony, as was Pythagoras, who preceded Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. And there was even this belief that, and Kepler was really a fan of this, that the orbital paths of the planets could be encompassed perfectly within the geometric solids, like a icosahedron or dodecahedron, and that if all of the planets were viewed appropriately, you could literally hear the music of the spheres, the perfect harmony of the solar system, as it were. Now, today we would consider that idea not very scientific. So one of the figures that forms a bridge between these two eras is this figure here. His name is Paracelsus. That's his nickname. He actually named himself that. He had a very long name. Very much a self-promoter. So he believed that the body, instead of the humoral theory, was based on chemicals, salt, sulfur, and mercury, and that if we understood the chemical balances within the human body, we could treat patients appropriately. And he adopted a like cures like. So if somebody had a fever, rather than giving them something cold to drink or applying cold compresses, you would do the exact opposite. Now, some of his treatments actually worked. So he didn't really necessarily establish the basis of modern medicine, but he did present more of a holistic understanding of the human body and kind of laid the foundations for the scientific revolution just by challenging the sort of Galenic authority in anatomy. So really, people who investigated the natural world, natural philosophers, were looking for uniform forces that could explain the different phenomena. So that's what astrology really is, which is not to be confused with astronomy, which is inherently mathematical. Astrology is noticing the placement of the planets and the stars in relationship to one another, in the belief that human fortunes actually can be foretold by how the planets are aligned, especially when you're born. By the way, I would just add that all Renaissance palaces and princes and monarchs had a court astrologer. Some of these people are called magi. In fact, Pico della Mirandola, who wrote the famous oration on dignity of man, would be considered sort of a magi. He was really influenced by Plato and Pythagoras and believed strongly that the idea that human beings are a bridge between the spiritual world and the physical world was reflected in his very optimistic view of human nature, that we can ascend almost to a near divinity, or we can lower ourselves down to the lowest depths of the material world. It's really our choice. So this is to be compared with the later Cartesian view. So Descartes introduced more of a mechanistic view, that there's a spiritual world, which is our minds and would eventually be God. But the thing that we investigate in science is not those things, because the scientific method can't help us understand that. It's the world of matter. Basically, the other world, the world of the visible world, is made up of particles that are in motion, and they obey certain natural laws. So this will eventually lead during the scientific revolution to a separation of spirit and matter, which was not taken for granted before this. So as I said, many of the so-called natural philosophers are very interested in astrology and alchemy. So Newton did experiments on alchemy, the idea that you could take metals and turn them into gold. As I might have mentioned before, the figure in Harry Potter, Nicholas Flamel, is an actual perfect example of the early Renaissance fascination with these sorts of forces, because he was looking for the so-called philosopher's stone. All right, so the person who brought all these ideas together, synthesized them all, is Isaac Newton, who stood on the shoulders of giants, as they say. Very reclusive person, never married, probably never had any kind of physical contact with anyone, sexual contact. He was mostly just like focused on literally eating, sleeping, and drinking, physics, and understanding the physical world. And by the way, there is the story about the apple falling on his head or near him, which led him to the conclusion that there was this force called gravity, which he hadn't worked out yet. That was the explanation for that. And that actually probably has some basis in fact, because there was a huge outbreak of the bubonic plague in London in the 1660s, and so he escaped from the city and went to the countryside to reflect and do his science, and that's when he was sitting under the tree. So he came up with 3 laws of motion, which he laid out in his Principia Mathematica. Those are the 3 laws, which basically are how we explain anything from the sort of macroscopic world that we investigate. Doesn't really work on the massive world of relativity theory, massive objects like planets and the sun. It doesn't work in the quantum world. But for most of the things we want to do in engineering, Newton's laws break things down in a very predictable way. And then this is his universal law of gravitation. Of course, you don't need to know the formula. It's just the amazing idea that a natural phenomenon can be expressed through a mathematical formula. And if you know all the variables and you know the formula and you know the force, you can actually predict what's going to happen next, which is one of the great powers of modern science. However, when Newton was asked, why does gravity work? Which we take it for granted, but it does seem strange that planets that are billions of miles away from each other should exercise any force on each other. And his answer is really what's called a brute fact. It's the end of the explanatory chain. He just basically said, because God is everywhere present, which is really, from a modern scientific view, not really an answer at all. In other words, I don't really know why it works, it just does. And so, like I said, he was a person who would have thought of his investigation of the natural world as almost like a religious exercise, not because he was all about doctrine and rituals, but because he thought of scientific investigation as ultimately understanding the cosmos in its totality, which had been created by God. So he's considered number 2 in the 100 because he, was the head of the Royal Mint, which coined the money in Great Britain. He was the president of the Royal Society. He invented calculus, which, it's hard enough to understand, let alone invent it. He contributed to our modern understanding of optics, or how we see objects, particularly color, in which this is why he was knighted as Sir Isaac Newton and buried in Westminster Abbey. Okay, so all of this created many serious questions about how do we reconcile belief in a supreme being, which is not just the faith part of it, but also God as an explanatory power in the cosmos. How do we reconcile the new materialistic mathematical science with belief in traditional religion? So 2 answers to that. One of them is by Baruch or Benedict Spinoza. So Spinoza came from a family of Portuguese Jews who were driven out of the Iberian Peninsula by the Inquisition, found their way to the more tolerant Netherlands. He, however, also found himself in difficulties with his Jewish synagogue, because his ideas were not supportive of the sort of idea of divine revelation, the belief in the Torah as the literal word of God in Moses, and so he was eventually excommunicated at the age of 23. It was a very severe excommunication. He was driven out of his community. So now he's a double exile because he was driven out of, he's a minority member as a Jew, and he doesn't even belong to that Jewish community. So luckily he had a series of friends who really supported him. He's one of the philosophers who really embraced living out his philosophy, not just taking an academic position and seeking patronage. So he started studying Cartesian dualism, and he came to reject this because he didn't think it made sense that 2 different kinds of things could possibly interact with one another. So instead of viewing there being 2 different substances, he said there's only one substance, and this substance is God. But it's not the anthropomorphic God. It's not the God of the Abrahamic religions. It's not a God who is an agent who loves you or hates you or punishes you or has laws or doctrines or sends prophets down or holy books. God is simply the unfolding of nature in all of its laws. God is everything that there is. So there's only one substance, but there's 2 different attributes of the substance. There's matter, which is extended or takes up space and follows the laws of nature. And then there's the idea of, minds, ideas. But minds are not a separate substance. The mind is simply the idea of the body. Every object has an idea about it, and the 2 things are basically parallel, and they both are causally determined by previous sequences. So everything in the world, in the universe, is determined. This is very controversial at the time because many people believed in free will, and this was all laid out in his famous Ethics, demonstrated in a geometric manner. And it really is laid out almost like a geometry book. So it has axioms and proofs and demonstrations. And the idea here is to come up with a rationalistic ethics. So a God that doesn't need to be worshipped, but a God that is nature itself. And the idea of humans is to understand our place within nature in its very limited way and accept that we are not above nature or can control nature. We are subject to the same forces of every other object in the universe. So we can be studied just like those objects. And so he came up with a sort of a rationalistic psychology. What causes us pain? What causes us suffering? Why do we suffer from mental illness? It's because we have formed what he called inadequate ideas about our place within nature, and if we understand why we come to hate something or someone, the idea is that we'll be freed from the tyranny that it has over our minds. So, like I said, a lot of people thought of him as an atheist because he accepted no traditional view of God, but he strenuously said, I'm not an atheist. I believe in a God. It's just a very different God than anyone else would possibly believe in at that time. All right, and then we have Blaise Pascal, who came out of the French Catholic tradition, but also dabbled in what's called Jansenism, which is a movement within Catholicism in France to push in a direction more associated with kind of a Calvinist view, that human beings do not have such great control over their own salvation, which was really the view the Jesuits had. So there's kind of a battle in France between the Jesuits, who educated most, wealthy people, and this Jansenist movement, which was still Catholic, but had much more of a pessimistic view of human nature. So Pascal was certainly a boy genius. He was able to work out by himself the 32 theorems of Euclidean geometry when he was 9 years old. He invented the world's first adding machine. It was too expensive to mass produce. And he came up with Pascal's triangle, which, is, you may know, is the system or the pattern of coefficients that exist in nature. And he also developed basically what are called conic sections, formulas for measuring solid objects. So he underwent a spiritual conversion, and he basically abandoned all of his mathematical studies. He wrote a famous book called The Pensées, which is basically just the thoughts. And this is essentially just his trying to explain the relationship between faith and reason, to articulate how we are somewhere between the Neo-Platonic view, which sees us as being almost as godlike creatures, and the Calvinist view, which sees us as being horribly spiritually depraved and worthy of nothing unless God's grace descends upon us. So he thought we were somewhere in between. And so his famous quote, there's many famous quotes from his book, The Pensées, is man is a reed, which is a thin grass that is in a swampy area, but a thinking reed. So essentially, our reason can help us understand the world around us, but it only takes us so far, because ultimately there's a certain mysterious aspect to God, just by God's very nature. God is beyond time and space, so there's no way we could possibly understand all of God's purposes and designs. So when it comes down to it, Pascal, who actually also developed probability theory, came up with a famous thought experiment called Pascal's wager. So we don't really know whether God exists or not. However, if you think about the odds of God's existing, and you think about the outcomes of believing or not believing, the idea here is that you should lay down your bet on the existence of God. And this is, of course, according to the traditional view of God, as somebody who rewards the faithful and punishes the unfaithful. But if God does exist and you bet on God, you have a life of eternal rewards in heaven. If you are wrong, then you just go to the same place that the unbeliever goes. You go into the ground and your body decomposes. But if you don't believe in God and you're wrong, the idea here is that you go to eternal punishment. And if you are right, you're in the same place as the believer. So clearly, given all of these factors, it's just much better to believe in God than not to believe in God. So what this sets up by the end of the 17th and into the 18th century is basically the first time in Western history that you could become an agnostic, an atheist, or a deist, which is challenging just the idea that God is necessary to explain experience. And so Descartes' separation of mind and matter, spirit, and the physical world basically eliminates the idea of a spiritual connection. So if you take Occam's razor and you just cut away the spiritual world, the world of God, angels, free will, minds, anything intangible, and you just believe that all of reality is basically just physical particles in motion that can be expressed through natural laws using mathematics, and you have a very different conception of the world than the way it was before, let's say, around the time of the Reformation. So this is what we call a mechanistic view of the world. The world's a machine. That's why we have a picture of a clockmaker. So the clockmaker is a god, a deist god, who's not involved in human affairs. This is the god who is powerful enough to come up with a machine that runs by itself and then just stands back and watches it go. There's no need to do miracles or intervene in human affairs. This is in contrast with the sort of medieval and ancient view of a vitalistic world. The world is filled with spirits and forces. I mean, It's called anima, is the word that Aristotle used. Anima just means a spirit. So that's where the word animation comes from. So you think of like it's a series of drawings that somebody's putting on a drawing board, and then you animate them by putting them together in such a way on a film that it looks like they have motion. So when you animate something, you give it life, you give it motion, you give it movement, and that's how the world was viewed before this mechanistic view of things. So the metaphor that comes out of this is God as the supreme clockmaker. So the whole Neo-Platonic gloss of sort of this mystical world that's inhabited by spirits and human beings can sort of tap into it, and we're part of an interesting hierarchy and we have an important exalted place within it, is all stripped away, and we are left with what will come to the Enlightenment in the 18th century is just a sort of very mechanistic view of the world with particles in motion that can be understood through this scientific method. And that's very powerful, but it also causes a lot of controversy for people who believe that the world should still be filled with faith and spirit. So this is why I would consider the scientific revolution to be possibly the most significant intellectual development in the course, especially in the CID, cultural and intellectual developments theme, and in the TSI, technological and scientific innovation theme.